I'm Kelly Riddle. I own Kelmar and Associates Private Investigations, and I'm also the founder of the Association of Christian Investigators. We have about 1,000 members throughout the U.S. and approximately 15 countries. I'm also the president-elect of the Texas Association of Licensed Investigators, which has about 650 members, and I have a diverse background. 7 years in law enforcement, have a degree in criminal justice. I got out of law enforcement, went to work for insurance companies doing their insurance investigations, and was eventually hired away by a company called Business Risk International. They had 26 offices throughout the world, and they ended up selling out to Pinkerton, which is why I started my business, and that was 1989. The Kel and the Mar comes from the fact that I used to have a business partner named Mark. First three letters of both of our first names, obviously. And I've written 10 books associated with the PI industry. I first got into protecting churches back when I was with John Hagee's church in San Antonio, Cornerstone, and was part of their original team that he developed. And it was developed out of necessity because he had what was called the Night to Honor Israel, which was back in the early 80s, I guess, 85-ish. And because of that, he would get death threats and bomb threats and everything else. And so the need for a security team developed out of that early on. And stayed with that church for about 17 years, and now I've moved over to Summit in San Antonio, Summit Christian Church. And my company does a variety of things, one of which is, we were talking at lunch, we do security consulting as well. So, for instance, when we built that new church, I donated most of my time and set up their cameras and their access, security access controls and all those kind of things, and you actually put them on CAD drawings and blueprints and et cetera, et cetera. So I have a diverse background. And one of the ones that I have kind of developed is background screening. And we have kind of a niche market for churches. And again, that's kind of where our heart is, where our ministry is. And so our pricing is related to that. And I'm not here to preach to you about our services, other than what I am going to tell you about is what to look out for. There's obviously a need for this, even if you just have volunteers. And this is part of the reason why U.S. Department of Justice reported that 1 in 32 people in the U.S. has spent time in jail, has been on parole or probation, and that average 1 in 7 candidates that you interview has a criminal past. And this is not any different from a church. In fact, sometimes it can be worse because you have these sinners that no one else will love. Hopefully they've been saved and they've been drawn to the church. So a lot of times we have issues with having a greater number. And part of that is churches have to develop their own policies. What is acceptable and what is not acceptable. Just like when we provide our services to corporations and government entities and stuff, it's not our job to tell you what is acceptable. That's an internal thing, but that's something that needs to be developed if you haven't. Because what misdemeanor or what felony would allow a person to be with the children, not with the children, as a volunteer in security, those kind of issues. So you need to, first of all, develop your internal policy as what is acceptable and what's not, if you don't already have one. And, the problem with any of this background information is the fact that, there's adverse action out there and Fair Credit Reporting Act, and we'll get into that in a minute. But, it's easier to do things right the first time than to defend a lawsuit for not hiring them or something along that line. So as some of the previous seminars has talked about, it's also easier to identify these individuals up front than it is to have to deal with those parties that would be potentially staff members who might be volatile. So that's what we're going to talk about. What is a good background check? First thing you need to develop is, what is good data? And what is the difference between going through an outside service versus an inside service? And we're going to talk about what is out on the internet and versus what you should get through a private investigator. And in a minute we'll talk about the difference between a private investigator and a data broker. But what constitutes a background check? When someone comes to me and says, I need to start running background checks on our volunteers and stuff, Okay, what does that mean to you? You know, we do insurance investigations, so insurance adjusters will call us up and say, we need you to do an activity check. All right, what is an activity check to them? Sometimes it means surveillance. Sometimes it means just go out and talk to the neighbors and see if the guy's mowing the lawn, you know. So what is it that you're talking about? And a typical background check for a volunteer or an average candidate, not a high-level management type person, would be a social security trace that identifies where they've been. And incidentally, there is no such thing as a national criminal check in the private sector. Any of you that's been in law enforcement know that the only national check comes through the FBI and then TCIC and all those law enforcement databases. So if someone is trying to sell you the fact that you can do a national criminal search in the private sector, they're not being upfront with you. The way that is done is you identify where they have lived based on their social security trace, and then that's where you run those searches. Or if you happen to get a tip that they were in Las Vegas and, you know, might have been pulled over or arrested or something like that, then you search places like that. But that is what the private industry considers a national check, any place that they have lived. Some say we don't even want to do that. We want to just narrow it down to the county itself, or we want to narrow it down to the state itself. And so at the very least, you should do a social security trace, you should do a statewide and a county search. And if it's a good database source now, they usually include sex offender and the Patriot Act, which is terrorist watch list. So those are the things that should be included at a very minimum. Then you can get into other things that are bells and whistles, and we'll go into that as well. Is a physical record search better than a computer search? Well, the obvious, or should be obvious, is yes, because I can point you to counties in West Texas that barely have patrol cars running, much less computers that are up and running, and that's the least of their concerns. Even though it's mandated for law enforcement and counties to provide that information to the clearinghouse, which is the FBI, it doesn't always get done, or it doesn't get done in a timely fashion. And so it should actually have a complementary service. So if you're using a database service and they don't have the ability to go gather information from the field, then it's probably a little short-sighted, because inevitably you're going to come across something that is going to not be complete. And by that I mean there's not a final disposition on the case, or there's some questionable information in there. It may not even be, it may be a question as whether or not it's the right individual or not. And the only way you can identify that is to go glean information out of the file itself. So again, database searches are good in and of themselves, but they should be complemented with a physical search. And can I depend on the internet on the internet information? And 9 times out of 10, I would say no. And again, it's because where that information is being gleaned from and how often it's being updated. So you got to know your sources. What if I need information from the actual files? Again, you know, that's going to be something that you're going to have to do if you've been around this at any point in time. Where does this information come from? Is it strictly out of generic, meaning public generated information? Because there is a difference between a data aggregator and a private investigator. And a data aggravator, I call them aggravator as a slip of the tongue, but it's actually true for me. Data aggregator is someone that compiles public information. And you'll have everything from driver's license to addresses, those kind of things that are gleaned from public information and compiled and then resold. And private investigators, on the other hand, they have to be licensed. There's someone that's overseeing them. And by the way, data aggregators, it could be a 16-year-old kid sitting, you know, with a server in his garage, and that is who you're getting that information from. All he's doing is doing a handshake with data sources, making a link. So in the state of Texas, we're going to go on into this a little bit further. There's the legality of getting information from a private investigator. So if you're utilizing a data service that in the state of Texas that is not a licensed investigator, there's a good chance that you, as well as they, may be violating the provisions of the Code 1702. And there is a little bit of a fine area there where if all they are doing is providing public information, then that is a data aggregator, and they don't necessarily have to be licensed. But the problem with that comes in, what happens if you ask for any reference checks, or if you go any further than just regurgitating that data? Now they have to be licensed. So you don't need to put yourself in that position to begin with, because there are civil and or criminal. Sources of data, most of you understand that it comes from the horse's mouth, which is county. For the most part, the district attorney's offices, that's where most of your cases are filed, whether it comes from the city, then you have state and federal courts, Department of Public Safety and Corrections. A lot of those records are being opened up, but just as conversely, there's a movement on to close those. And being part of the Texas Association of Licensed Investigators, we have a legislative team that watches bills that are in the process. Someone is trying to slide through. And last year alone, we monitored about 90 bills that had a direct effect on whether or not information would be available to us as private investigators and therefore to the industry. And it's a very simple argument on my part, because you have a representative that will introduce a bill to limit information. And I just simply ask them, all right, if you've got a child in a daycare and you're concerned that there might be a pedophile in there, do you want to know? And the answer is always yes. So you can't have it both ways. Either you're going to have stuff available or you're not going to have it available. Plus the fact that the horse is already out of the starting gate. I mean, how do you corral that information that's already out there? It's kind of a moot point, Most of this information y'all are aware of, so I'm not going to stick on that. However, there is a website that some of you may be aware of, that's the DPS website, Texas Department of Public Safety, and other states have the same thing, and more are coming online. But what you need to be aware of is a recent survey showed that about 1/3 of the criminal records were missing from their DPS site, and that's the public access site, not the law enforcement site. And so in Texas, you can log on to their site, and I think it's $2.35 or $2.50 mark. Yeah, is it gone up? $3.50. Yeah, $3.50, something like that. So anyway, it's gone up apparently, but for roughly $4, you can log on and do your own search. But the problem with that is it's garbage. And that's why when they first came out with this years ago, I did test cases. I go, all right, I know this person has criminal history, so then I would run them over here. And there was about 20 of them just quick that I figured out it wasn't showing up. So I didn't put my trust in that source. But unfortunately, you have private employers and data churches and everybody else that doesn't know that, and they're utilizing it. There was cases that they found that were even death row, people on death row didn't show up in that database, which is kind of hard to believe. It's gone all the way through the process. And that DPS, by their own admission, said there's 69% of the counties submitted case outcomes last year. Case outcomes is the final disposition. It's one thing to report the arrest. It's another thing to figure out, to finish that and say, all right, what happened? What was the outcome? Was there probation, parole? What was the final disposition of that? It may be that they were on deferred adjudication. And the handout that I gave you actually has some of those terms in it. If you're not familiar with it, it's a quick reference kind of thing, because when you get searches back, there will be terminology that even the best, trained individual may not understand, and it's because of the way that they abbreviate it. And so that's a quick reference for you. It might help out. Dallas County records audit found that records were certified as being complete and accurate when in fact some of them weren't. And again, in that same study, it showed that part of the problem was you had people that were not properly trained. Secondary to that, as Dan mentioned, you got government employees that they don't really care. They're sitting there inputting the information. And so therefore, if they misspell something or they don't put it in there, it's not, it's just a job. So you got to treat that for what it's worth. Then you have situations like this out there. Part of our task is to call references, follow up with colleges and universities, see whether or not they have a legitimate degree or not. There are sites out there just like this one. This is one of about 5 of them that I've stumbled across, and they will dummy that up for you. You choose what it is you want to say, and they've got like templates where they give you the employment. So if you've been in prison for 5 years, they can fill in that gap for you. Or if you need job references or whatever the case may be, this is a cut and paste thing. And so if we were trying to validate that, they would give you a number that they change the number, obviously, so people like us can't immediately identify it. So we would call up and we say, we're doing a background in reference to a person that's applied for a job and they've listed you as a former employer, and so we're trying to validate that. Well, they already have the information. They've already dummied that up, and so this makes our job harder, and it makes verifying it even harder, which is why now a lot of employers and a lot of universities are changing to the hotline. So you have employment hotlines and you have university hotlines, and so it's almost, I can almost tell you, the larger corporations and companies and that kind of thing, if it's a hotline situation or not. So it doesn't do us any good to even call them, because they're going to say, you have to call the hotline, here's our employment number, and that you got to punch in, and it usually costs us $13 to $13.50 for us to do that, and it's basically a pass-through. So if you see, when you're doing background checks and you're checking vendors' prices, understand that that's what we're dealing with. Sometimes there's a pass-through cost that we can't do anything about. If it's costing us $13, we can't give it to you for $13. We have people that actually have to do that and then load it onto our system. So there are some inherent prices that we just can't deal with. But this goes to show you what's out there now. Everybody has a way to break the system, it seems like. So you've done everything you can think of. You've got your policies in order. You know what you're going to accept, what you will tolerate, what's going to be if someone has a DWI charge or whatever the case may be. We know what now is going to be the cutoff for y'all. But why do cases get missed? Because they inevitably will. And part of it is because, are you looking for convictions and arrest, or are you just looking for arrest? Because we have some that say, I don't want to know anything about a conviction. I just want to know what the final disposition is. If they were arrested, if they were convicted, then I don't care, if they were just arrested. Well, that's short-sighted, because what if someone just got arrested for being a sexual predator, and now they're in your church and they want to go be a volunteer in the children's ministry, because it hasn't gone through the court system yet, and it hasn't been finally adjudicated as being guilty or not guilty or whatever, but there's an arrest there. So to me, that's a touchy situation. I would rather know what's out there, and then I can make an informed decision. If you don't know that there was ever an arrest, you may be opening yourself up for liability. What is the years that you're being searched, that you are searching? Now, on a typical candidate, according to the Fair Credit Reporting Act, you can only go back 7 years. But that's 7 years from the original charge. So if you find, it's kind of like the IRS, if you go back and you find one that was 7 years ago, and before that there was another case that was combined with that one, or they got probation. It's not when the person ended their probation, it's when the original charge was. So you can legally go back further than that if you have the right parameters in which to do that. In upper management, you can go back 10 years. But again, if you're not familiar with the Fair Credit Reporting Act, we're going to go into some of those parameters. Using wrong identifiers, and this is more common on women than it is men, because you have maiden names and they've been divorced and that kind of situation, or typical misspelling. And I've run into situations myself where I know the person's name was Smith. It's kind of hard to misspell Smith, but when you actually find the record, and I had this happen down in Laredo, Texas, on the border. We had a client call up, and we ran a background, and we found 3 charges, and they said, well, I know there's at least 7, because we found newspaper articles where talking about 4 other ones. So I got them to fax that to us, and then sure enough, when the clerk, whoever it was, entered that information into the county database, they put an E on the end. So It's common spelling of Smith, but who would have thought, put an E on the end of Smith, because it was nowhere else. And so I don't know if it's a typo or if they did it on purpose, or what the case may be. We haven't figured that one out yet. But again, you have to use parameters. Search as wide as possible if you have a doubt. Most systems that you utilize should be just the opposite, because the more parameters that you put in, the more specific you'll get. So if you put in name, date of birth, any aliases, last known address, and social security number, chances are you're going to get the right person. So it's kind of the opposite when you're doing a database search, unless you're doing a wild card search and you're going, man, I know there's something out there, and which time you want to back it up and be a little bit more lenient on your searches. Different jurisdictions have different methods of classifying offenses, and I'll show you this when it comes to sexual predators and stuff. I have some slides that relate this, but as a point in case, one of our contracts that we have is with the Chicago Metropolitan Water District. And Illinois is among 4 or 5 states up in that quadrant of the United States that for us gives us a little problem, because they called us one day and said, look, the candidate put on his application that he had 2 charges, 2 convictions, and you didn't find them. Well, come to find out, when we did some digging, it was in a suburb of Chicago, which still should have been reported. But we physically sent somebody out there and talked to them. And the suburb had their own judge and magistrate and all that kind of stuff. And they told us point blank, said, look, we don't report that to the county. It never makes it onto a database. And we said, well, first off, that's, you're stepping on federal guidelines. And they said, yeah, whatever. And so, that was kind of their mentality. It's like, yeah, whatever. And so when we got down to the basis of the charges, one of them was a DWI. And we said, all right, well, why is the DWI not showing up? And they said, because we classify that as a driving offense, not a criminal offense. And then he also had, this individual had it was an assault, family battery kind of charge, and it didn't show up. And we said, well, why is it not showing up as a criminal offense? And they said, because here it's a civil offense. And I'm going, I don't know anywhere else in the United States where an assault is a civil. I mean, you can turn a civil lawsuit, into it, but it is a criminal offense. So again, sometimes we look a little stupid, but it's not because of our own doing. It's because of the way that it's classified or not reported, something of that nature. Then you have overlapping jurisdictions. What if you're in the DFW area? You got Tarrant County and you got Dallas County and all the counties surrounding it. Which county are you looking for? Are you looking at the right county, or do you need to cross over jurisdictions possibly? And a lot of times people will give us a driver's license number, and they say, I know he's got a driver's license number, and he's going to drive a bus for us, and go pick up kids and stuff. Well, come to find out, that's an ID number. It's not a driver's license, So the information that you have may not always be, the correct information. Different jurisdictions, like I said, all this stuff is supposed to be reported to the county or the state repository, and that's where it's gleaned out of. And what constitutes a misdemeanor or a felony is up to different jurisdictions. And having been in law enforcement, I remember the jurisdiction where I worked. When I first went to work for them, it was a violation to possess alcohol. Possession of alcohol, not consuming it or anything else, just to have it in your possession. And then I was a police officer for 7 years, so about 5 years into this, they changed the law, and that no longer existed anymore. So, in my mind, I'm like, all right, well, what happened to these poor people that got charged with, possession of alcohol? Now they've got this criminal record following them around, and so, where's the justification in some of that? And the point of it is, again, you have to set up your own guidelines as to whether or not, possession of alcohol is going to keep someone out of a position or not. But again, in some jurisdictions that may be a Class C, may be a Class B, And so if you just say anything that's a Class B or a Class A, or if you just go by the classification itself, you may be missing some good people. So you have to have a little bit of flexibility there. is the right person's info being searched? Use the personal identifiers that you have, and if he's a candidate for employment, then, or being a volunteer, you should be able to have that information readily available. So and verify it. And in this part of the country, a lot of times we ask for a social security number because it's an easy identifier and it helps us verify the person's name. But unfortunately, in this part of the world, some people buy social security numbers, and we're able to come back to you and say, all right, this social security number is not matching to the right person, or it's showing as invalid. So now we come back to you and say, you need to do further verification as to that. And there's the I-9 law, which I don't know if you're familiar with, but in Arizona, like they are leading the nation in a bunch of other things, they have the I-9 law, which means that as an employer, they have to verify that person's social security number, and they also have to verify citizenship, and it's through the I-9 system, and that's a government access system, and so that's going to make its way throughout the land, and that's going to be something we're all going to have to deal with, which will be another charge that will have to be passed on, unfortunately. The other thing is this characteristic of that individual? So if you know that the guy was in the military, the only place that he's lived outside of the Houston area is when he went to Germany and was over there for 4 years, came straight back, and there's nothing to indicate that he was ever up in Oregon, which is where this data is saying that he was arrested for drunk driving and running over mailboxes and all kinds of stuff. Is that characteristic of that individual? So there may be some additional digging, because our system, as do most, passes on as much information as we can give you. So if there's a John Smith, same age, same date of birth, different state, that's got a bunch of charges on it, but there's nothing else that helps us identify whether it's the right individual that you provided to us, we're going to give you that information with a little disclaimer down there, for you to do additional follow-up. Everyone tries to make it as concrete as possible. We try not to give you any data back that is not 100%, but at some point we just don't know, especially when it comes to federal records. And if you ever have anybody that's charged with drug trafficking or on a federal level, anything like that, I mean, it's called PACER. PACER system is what all that is filed in. PACER system does not have that information. You physically have to send somebody to the court to get it. So I mean, we're going to regurgitate that to you, and then if you request additional research, then we can do that additional research. Contact the reporting agency for clarification, and any good data provider that you use should have the ability to be a mediator. So if you have a candidate that says, I'm telling you that's not me, I did not do that, it got the wrong person, then they should be able to have a copy, well they have to, according to the FCRA, have a copy of that and be able to remedy that, which means for us, if you're contracting with us to do your work, we need to know what you want us to do. Do you want us to talk to your people or not? So if someone calls up to us and says, got this report and it says that I was arrested and it's not me, or my attorney was supposed to take care of it, that's what we normally hear, my attorney was supposed to take care of it, we don't immediately talk to them, because if we don't have your permission to do so, we are not going to do that. We're not going to speak on your behalf. But a lot of people tell us, yes, help us remedy this. So that's what we'll do, and we'll try to walk them through and say, well, were you in Harris County during this time? Do you have any other criminal charges? And we'll kind of walk them through it, and eventually they'll go, well, I was picked up on it, but my attorney said he was going to get deferred adjudication or get it expunged or whatever, and either the attorney didn't do it or they didn't expunge it, and that's not our fault. I mean, we can't tamper with a government record, so that's ultimately that's the end result of that. Is we say, look, this is a government record. We cannot tamper with this. You have to go back to the source and rectify it through them. So we kind of guide them in those procedures. And then we can also check for photos, and especially if it's mug shots and all those kind of things now. A lot of those are coming online, so we can get the charge, provide you a photograph and say, yep, that's him, or nope, that's not him, one of those kind of things. And I'm actually privy to a new database that's coming out now that is going to be absolutely amazing. There's a company in Florida, and I was down there about 2 months ago, and they have 500,000 square feet of office, and I'm doing a beta test for them now, and this database is so incredible because if you've ever pulled reports and stuff, they are cleaning it up. I mean, they literally have a room about this size with programmer after programmer after programmer sitting there, and they're taking that information that's usually out there and they're cleaning it up so that you don't get duplicate information, but they're taking it a step further. If there's ever been a photograph of you out on MySpace or Mugshot or whatever, they're pulling that into that one database, and then they're doing IP address and email addresses, and you know, there was stuff on mine when I pulled it. I was going, man, this has never shown up on any database. Just incredible. And the guy that owns the company has a heart, you know, has a heart for charities and for children, and so he has a section of this office space that's dedicated to law enforcement, and he had FBI and marshals and everybody and their dog there. You know, all law enforcement were there, and so what happens if you're law enforcement, have law enforcement access, and by the way, he's going to give this away to law enforcement. Just give it away, and the guy's got, you know, hundreds of millions of dollars, and he's very affluent, so it's not a money issue to him. This database, he showed us a case where in Jacksonville, Florida, there was a girl that was kidnapped, and on the map he showed her, right, here's the house, here's the route she took, and here's where she was kidnapped from. He said, now watch this, and he had a circumference circle pop up and all these dots, red and blue. He said, now the blue ones, that's everybody that has traded in porn within the last 30 days. And you click on one of those and there are spiders, and he said that's everybody else that they're connected to. And so he said, now watch this, the red ones, these are all the convicted pedophiles. And there was all of them, I mean, there's just tons of them along this little route that this girl had taken and stuff. So guess what? That gives law enforcement immediate leads, you know, to go start doing their investigation on and stuff. And that's just one of the bells and whistles that he has. So it's going to be an amazing database. It's going to change the face of everything. So it's just going to get better for us, and it's going to be cheaper because as he turns it out to the private sector, this report is going to be 25 cents. And it's going to be everything. I mean, criminal, I mean, it's going to be what we call a dossier, which gives you all the pertinent information. So, you know, it's going to drive the price down, going to give you better information, and so that's kind of on the horizon, and I would envision that that's probably going to be out. The beta test is going on now, so it'll probably be out by the end of the year. I know it will. He's got a time frame sooner than that. Yes.
Who's he going to sell that to?
Oh, he's going to sell it to private investigators, private industry, corporate, you know, security, that kind of thing. You got to be corporate security licensed in some format, and then he has different access levels. So he's going to have you know, bronze, gold, silver, platinum PIs, and so the platinum is going to have more. You got to have more qualifications to have platinum access, which is, I think, 10 years, minimum 10 years as a PI and prior law enforcement, and some additional things, you know. But it's going to
give it to law enforcement.
Yeah, but we'll pay for it, obviously. But here's another problem. You know, there's the Compact National Crime Prevention and Privacy Compact was designed to facilitate the exchange of information between states. Not every state is in agreement with that, and there's more that's coming online with them. Some of them have kind of handshake agreements and behind the scenes kind of contractual agreements, but this is, you'll see the compact states, there's 27 of them, and then there's no known current action from about 18 of them, and there's the problem for a lot of databases, is because they're not handshaking. So again, if someone tells you that they're doing a national criminal background on somebody, how could they possibly do it when the states are not abiding by, you know, this privacy compact? So again, the information is not crossing over. It's getting better, but and part of the reason is a lot of states are coming on board with it because they're seeing the revenue generation from it. Because if I move from Alabama to Texas and I owe some fines and stuff in Alabama, I can't get a driver's license and all that other good stuff until I satisfy those judgments back here, liens and everything else. So state liens. So they're seeing that there's a benefit to it. One of the biggest problems is differences in computer formats and programs. You know, they don't have the same technology or whatever, so that's slowing the process down. Same thing with interstate fingerprint systems. You have, you know, this fingerprint file, which is supposed to, it doesn't supposed to, it requires, anytime a person is picked up for an offense, the first time a set of fingerprints has to go to the FBI so that they can start classifying them. Well, not everyone does that, and you can see from this chart that it's still lacking, and it doesn't require, you know, a state. It's not cumbersome on the state, because if a person's picked up a second, third, fourth time and they're already in the system, they don't have to send another set of fingerprints. You know, so it's not about you know, a hardship on the states, as some of them want to try to state. Problems in implementing these requirements, there's quite a few of them, unfortunately. Not all states are 100% automated. The differences in field formats, lack of final dispositions in the case itself. Some departments are doing the old ink fingerprint, some are doing digital, some are doing live scan. So you know, they're getting it in different formats. 16 states do not maintain the fingerprints that they process as part of a background. So in other words, if you go to Houston Police Department and ask them to do a digital fingerprint for you so that you can apply for this job or this license or whatever, and I'm not saying it's Houston, but you know, they may not keep that information. They have got it on their computer at that point because they just generated a digital for you. So just because they have it doesn't mean that they're saving it, which is a big problem as well. I know in San Antonio, which is where I'm from, the police department there has their own ID system section. So once that person is arrested, yes, it goes to the FBI, but then secondary, it goes to their own internal classification system, and they have fingerprint people there, and that's their job. Plus, there's over 100 million criminal records in repositories, but only approximately 65 million are accessible through the federal databases. So, you know, again, this shows you where some of the problems are. Only 19 states accept information on scars, tattoos, and marks. Well, that's, if I was still in law enforcement, that'd be a big problem, because, you know, gangs, that's their tats and stuff are how you identify who's a gang member, and you know, that's valuable information. But again, you know, not tracking that information limits the availability to stop that. And if you've got a church environment where you're in a population where there are a lot of gang members, you might want to know that, you know. So it could be important to us as well. 9 states don't even flag felony convictions. I mean, they don't have that capability. So again, it's kind of like the horses before the cart. Plus the fact that there's a huge backlog of entering information, and part of that again comes to budgets. Everybody screams budgets, you know, so I don't have the people to do that. And as a sideline to that, my investigation company, one of our specialties is truck and cargo thefts. And so one of the insurance companies that we do work for, they've got big pockets, and they said, look, we can't recover 18-wheelers if it's not in NCIC, which is the computer database, you know, that tracks stolen vehicles. So, you know, they've done everything they could. You know, we go out there and we have to be on the scene within 2 hours after the theft is reported. And our job is to make sure that everything's being done. We know we do the field investigation and everything else. And part of our job is to encourage the police department to enter it onto their system. Well, we've had them just point blank tell us, look, it's a budget issue. We'll get to it when we get to it. So now this insurance company has authorized us, said, you know, if that's what they say to you, tell them you'll pay the man hours. You know, they pay us and we pay them, basically, you know. So that's kind of one angle in which to overcome that. You know, when you got someone's being proactive like that. This insurance company even said, all right, we're going to put cameras down on the border because we have so many vehicles and cargoes being stolen and going into Mexico. Well, then Homeland Security goes, no, we can't put any cameras near the border that the government's not controlling, you know. So you start getting into all the red tape. Current trends affecting backgrounds, the eradicating racism and colorism from employment. basically what that means is, no profiling, it comes down to it, which is using credit scores and certain employment tests and software that flags, where they live, being a crime area and all those kind of things. So there's a part of the legislators out there that are really pushing that. And then you have the Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, which makes policies a manifest relationship to employment, which is basically just because a person has a criminal history, does that have any bearing on the job that they've applied for? So in other words, if it's a DWI and they're applying to be a school bus driver, then there's a direct, association. But if the guy had possession of marijuana and he's going to work on the factory plant, is there a direct correlation? In my opinion, yes, because he's, if he's high, he might cut off his hand or something, endanger somebody else. But those are the things they're looking at. Must be a relevance of the offense to the job itself. And then the Fair Reporting Act, continued litigation associated with that, and improper job hiring and adverse action letters, and we're going to go into that in 1 second. Here's a case, an example of how things slip through the crack. This is the actual case. Nelson used the legal system to change her name 11 times in 3 years. Each time she changed her name, she obtained a new Washington State ID card or driver's license. She then used IDs and stolen social security numbers to open bank accounts under her new name and allegedly wrote scores of bad checks. Once the bank caught on to the fraud, she would go back to the court, change her name, and begin the cycle anew. Nelson is one of 11 defendants facing federal charges as a result of Operation Name Game, lengthy investigation in Washington State. So she used the system to change her names. You can go down to almost any county and do an assumed name. An assumed name basically means, it's designed for, I'm going to open up John's Landscaping Service. And to open up a corporate account at a bank, you either got to be incorporated, you got to have some document that verifies that you are a company. So at the very least, it's doing a DBA, doing business as, and you file that, and for $15 you go down to the state, go down to the bank, and they open up an account. Well, people have figured this out. They can go change their names. And kind of the same thing that they do with terrorists. Terrorists, that name gets hot and they go change their name, and they can do it legally. Sex offender searches. This is a hot topic for me because there's so many holes in it. This is an actual search that we did in the state of Wisconsin, and you'll see the top half of this says no registrants found with the last name like Cooper and a last name like Christopher. And so we backed it off and we said, all right, what about Cooper and just Chris? And we kept backing it up and everything else. And the Wisconsin Circuit Court may order that a person convicted of a sex crime register as a sex offender for another 10 years following the end of a jail probation. So what that tells you is one of the reasons we didn't find it is because their law enables them to have a duration on when a person that's been charged with a sexual offense has to maintain their registry and be, out in the public basically. And you'll see this one, it was terminated. So, even though, we know from statistics that pedophiles and sexual offenders have a propensity to be repeat offenders, this is kind of letting them out of that by taking that away from us. Charges found in this case, these are actually the charges that we found. Sexual predator contact with a child 16 or older, second degree sexual assault, again and again and again, different places. So in this particular case, there was also interfere with custody of a child, bail jumping, and 5 cases of theft. So again, if our legislation is not proper, we allow them to not face the consequences. Here's a second case, and no records were found again in Illinois, but again, you'll see that we actually found the case, second degree aggravated criminal sexual abuse. And you'll see here, if we return this to you, that means that there's a photograph attached to it. And so if a person's going, that's not me, go check the photograph. State of Oregon, sex offender inquiry system. This is actually off of their website, listed as public information under Oregon revised statute. the following information on the approximately 760 predatory sex offenders currently posted to the website. So why are all the registered sex offenders contained in the registry not listed on the public website? And this is why. Oregon law currently allows state police to post only those registered offenders who have been designated predatory under the Oregon law. As of May 2007, the unit maintained files on over almost 14,000 individuals who are required to register in Oregon. Only 760 were posted to the website. So you have contradiction within their own system. And incidentally, that's why if you do a search, and again, any good database service, background screening service, is going to give you, for the most part, free sex offenders, because it really didn't cost us anything. You know, we just do a handshake with all the state repositories and all the national repositories. That information is free, so you shouldn't be charged for it. But you should do a state search and you should do a national search, because those are things that can be done. So don't just do one or the other. Fake credentials is another problem. If you know, with this day of printers and software and everything else, it's not hard to change diplomas and reference letters and military records and everything else. And military records are hard for us to verify, because there's only certain information that you can verify quickly. You know, because employers always go, well, you know, he says he's, you know, has a clean bill of health with the military, Purple Heart, and all this other stuff, but yet they want that information tomorrow because they're trying to hire somebody. So, you know, it just doesn't work that way. To get that in depth, it requires 2 to 6 weeks. So, you know, it is what it is, unfortunately. FCRA compliant, basically you need to be aware, if you're not already, and if you don't have this set up within your church, you need to make sure that you are aware of it and set these policies up. If you do a pre-employment, even on a volunteer, and it comes back with any adverse information, they are entitled to that information. You have to give them what's called an adverse action letter, which basically states, we ran this background on you and the background turned up that you were charged with 3 counts of battery, and this is where it listed, you know, Bexar County, Houston, whatever. And so they're entitled to that information, and legally you have to provide it to them. So what features should your vendor provide you? You know, first of all, there should be no membership fees. Used to be everybody was charged, you know, $450 or whatever just to have access to it. There should be no monthly fees or annual fees. There should be applicant interface. Interface is, you know, if you got a good HR system, you can interface with your HR software. Email notifications, so that, you know, if you go online and you put in the information and it's not an instant search, it will email you when that information is online and completed. And jurisdiction lookup, if you're not sure if it's a multi-jurisdiction issue, there should be a drop-down box and it will tell you kind of where you need to search. Pre-search screening, if you think maybe our company or church has done a search on this individual before, you can do a pre-search and see if you have, and that will save you money and time and everything else. No need rerunning someone that you've already ran, you know, and decided you're not going to hire. Domestic and international, especially in this part of the world, you got to be able to do things down in, you know, Mexico and Central America and Canada. We do a lot up in Canada as well. Password and authentication. Hopefully, you know, if they're not passworded and authenticated, it's a problem from the very beginning. And this is just an example of what a background should look like. You know, it should give the person's regurgitate. The top portion should regurgitate what you gave them. Yes, ma'am.
What about having watchdog services continuing throughout their employment?
Yeah, absolutely. Good point. She said, what about watchdog services throughout their employment, which is a great idea. You know, just because someone was clear the first time that you ran a background on them doesn't mean that they're going to stay that way. And good point. Especially if they're a long-term individual. And coming from an investigative background, I can tell you that the person most likely to embezzle money or you know, to commit a criminal offense within a business is that person that never takes time off, never takes sick days, never takes vacation days, everything else, because a lot of times, you know, they don't want anybody else to uncover what they're doing. You know, if they let somebody else onto their desk, it's going to be known. So you have regurgitated information, you have name, most current addresses, and then aliases and anything pertinent to that, and then the actual record itself. Here's another touchy situation. Social networking. We have some government contracts for the most part that we do social networking searches on, and one of them in particular is a fire department, and we do it on every one of their candidates. And you would not believe, our generation typically, not going to put stuff out on the internet, on MySpace and everything else, but we found everything from, guys with their head in the toilet, after partying all night to, strippers and all kinds of stuff, and so what people are putting out on these social networking sites are just really interesting. But again, you got to use that with a little bit of salt, because what happens, if you follow the legislation that's out there that's trying to get pushed through, does that have a bearing on the job that they're going to do for you? So just because they're a partier doesn't mean, what they do after work doesn't necessarily have any implication to what they're doing for you. So that's still a kind of a gray area for a lot of employers. They don't know what to do with that, but it's a touchy-feely thing, and I'm sure it's going to be more defined by legislation as we go along. But it is a useful tool. Social networking surveys, as much as 40% of today's employers are now using these sites, and 1/3 report they found content that caused them to dismiss the candidate from consideration. And I'm not going to go through all these statistics and stuff, but that will tell you in and of itself that it's an increasing tool by HR departments. But the problem with that, again, is don't open yourself up for a libelous lawsuit because you didn't hire them because of something that was on there, because they can always come back to you and say, look, that's something I didn't even post on there. Somebody, matter of fact, my wife called me. I've got a professional Facebook account. My wife called me one day and she said, have you looked at your Facebook account? And I said, no, I go there about every 3 days or something. She said, you ought to go look. And so there was this guy on there that was questionable sexual orientation on there, and you follow that link, and some of the things he was associated with. My wife's going, who is this guy? And I said, I don't know, man. I immediately deleted him and everything else, but just because it's your or their account doesn't necessarily mean that other people can't put adverse information in there. So be cognizant of that. Comes down also to who's the big players in the data industry, and Reed Elsevier, they own everybody, all the big boys now. It keeps getting gobbled up. So Reed owns ChoicePoint. ChoicePoint owns Accurate. Accurate is part of LexisNexis, and so a lot of the same information that's out there is coming from the same source. They're just repackaging it different. So you need to understand who the players are, so like as PIs, a lot of times I probably have 30 different databases we get stuff from, but this one's good because it gives me better social security information. This one's better because it's better criminal information, whatever the case may be. But ultimately, a lot of them are the same. I'm just getting it packaged a little bit different. So any other questions or comments? Because we're running out of time here quickly. Okay. Yes, sir.
I've discovered too that about 20% of the states are not reporting anything online. So if I've got an applicant from Louisiana, for instance, how do I decide what parishes to do a hand check at a local courthouse? Tulsa's a place. Oklahoma does report online, but a number of our counties don't. How do you determine? If I live in Tulsa, I may party in Creek County. Creek County doesn't report anything. How do you make that decision?
Well, typically, what most employers do is they check the county that the person lives in or has lived in within the last 7 years. So if they lived in this one for 3 years and they lived in this one for 4, you check both of them because the FCRA says you can go back 7 years. So check the counties that they've lived in for the last 7 years. That's what most people do. And then, like for us, we do a statewide, multi-states, what it's called, which is we check, for instance, state of Texas and the 33 top counties, which are all your big ones basically. And then if they don't live in those 3 top counties, then they need to specifically request that county that came off of their social security trace. And that's about the best you can do, because otherwise you're going to spend a ton of money. And what you can expect to pay for something like that. It depends on who you're going through. You know, for us, we have special pricing for churches, and you know, for Social Security trace, multiple state search, county search, sex offender, and the Patriot Act. I think we're charging $10, but a lot of people will charge 25 and up. You know, so I'm not trying to sell you my product. I'm just trying to tell you, you know, be cognizant of what the pricing is out there. And like I said, it's going to come down because of the other database that's coming out on the market. So, you know, if you're paying more than $15 on a regular basis, I mean, if you may have to pay more than $15 because the guy lived in 30 different counties, but on a regular average case, you should not be spending more than $15. And on your side of the coin, that's $15 that may keep you out of a lot of litigation and or bad PR. On our side of it, you know, $15 is not worth the liability. You know, I mean, but it's volume. Everything's controlled by volume. So your side of it is like, you know, I used to be in law enforcement, so I know how to go down to the courthouse and do the searches myself. Well, number one, they're paying you, you know, a significant income. That's not where they need you to spend your time, you know. So you got to figure that aspect out. Any other questions, comments? Yes, sir.
How do you deal with a case when somebody's arrested for a sexual offense and then they plead it down with the authorities, and you come back with a Class C misdemeanor?
Yeah,
How do you deal with that?
Yeah, well, unfortunately, you know, the ultimate thing is what were they convicted of, and so you almost have to go with what was the final charge that they pled to, or final disposition of the case. The question was, what happens if you start with a sexual predator offense and it's plea bargained down? You know, how do you deal with that? And ultimately, what you've got to do is deal with is what is on record, what is on file as the permanent record. And I just went through that with a friend of mine who his daughter is dating a guy, and he asked me to run a background on him, and sure enough, you know, he came back with some significant stuff on his background, and one of them, it said it was a felony. So he went to his daughter and to her boyfriend and said, look, you know, this is what I got, and she was the bookkeeper of his company, and he's got a multi-million-dollar company, so there's a lot of concerns there, and he brings this letter from the probation officer that says, you know, this was deferred adjudication and it's not considered a conviction. So to me, that's semantics, you know, and because basically to get deferred adjudication, you have to plead, you have to agree to it and plead to it, and it's like getting stopped by a traffic police officer, given a ticket for speeding. You cannot have that show up on your record by simply going to the court, paying the court cost, and you have to plead and say, you know, no contest, and pay the fine, and if you don't get that charge, another speeding within 3 months or 6 months or whatever, it won't show up. But, you know, so to me it's a little bit semantics, because it did show up, and I told him, I said, that letter from the probation or parole officer has no standing. They cannot tell the court that case does not represent a conviction. If you get a letter from the court itself, now that's a different story. So again, you know, that could have been one of those situations where, you know, he's kind of a charismatic guy. He probably had a probation officer and said, look, man, this is going to follow me all around the rest of my life, so is there anything you can do? And they were kind enough to give him this letter. But I told him, I said, you know, that's going to follow him every time he applies, because it's on his record, and he's going to have to go through this every time. So, you know, at some point, it's not worth the hassle, you know. And that, because of litigation and stuff, you almost have to go with what was the actual charge, you know, that he was convicted with or pled to. Anything else? Okay, great. Appreciate it. Thank you very much.